Anyway, we all know what happened next. And there is, of course, a quote from Moffat where he was still in charge of the show at the time. And he advocated for all of the DEI rubbish that started to creep in while Capaldi was Doctor. But remember, of course, when you are the showrunner of a BBC show, you pretty much have no choice but to say all that crap. Like, we need to represent more different colours and women and feminism and blah, 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 blah. Of course, you're going to have to say that. You work for the fucking BBC. They're communists. So I never bought that Moffat actually really believed in this.
Sorry, I almost spit out my coffee. Sorry, Sorry, so I'm assuming that we're dealing with the definition of communism when government does stuff? I'm assuming... Okay, firstly, I don't recall there ever being an interview where Stephen Moffat was talking about DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And even then, like, I'm assuming that he could be referring to the interview that Stephen Moffat did when he was talking about Thin Ice. And there was the idea that they were casting people of colour during the Frost Fairs in the 18th century. And he was like, oh, you basically have to tell a lie. We're trying to sell an idealised version of history. And, like, firstly, Doctor Who has portrayed people of colour in the past before as, like, background extras and such. Like, the Shakespeare Code does it as well. I'm not here to try and show the Shakespeare Code as a beacon of progressivism or whatever. Obviously not. It's written by fucking Gareth Roberts. But, like, you know, when Martha Jones is like, oh, I'm not going to get carted off as a slave, and she's having that conversation with the Doctor, and he's like, oh, it's still not too different from your time. And then in late 16th century London streets, there are women of colour who are walking around, who are once again dealing with, it wasn't woke in 2007, but it's woke in 2016, because that's where my frame of reference is, and I'm formally soup-brained. But when it comes to, like, the idea that, oh, Stephen Moffat says that we have to tell a lie to portray people of colour in the background of the London Frost Fairs, I don't like that interview, because Stephen Moffat is incorrect. Like, you don't have to lie about that, because there were people of colour in London. Like, obviously, they were like only in their tens of thousands in terms of sheer numbers, but they were there. They did exist. Like, even at the absolute latest, we do know historically that there have been black people in the UK since the Roman Empire, since the early Roman period. And of course, that's at the absolute latest. There's evidence that dates back even further. Black people have always been here. So it's the idea that we're absolutely furious at historically inaccurate race swapping in, like, Wild Blue Yonder with Isaac Newton, but we also hate true historical accuracy in stories like Thin Ice. It's basically they just don't want black people in media. That's just the beginning and end to it. That's just it. They just don't want them in media. And part of it is because they don't... Like, this is a massive tangent. We might talk about this later. He might bring this up again. Basically, don't watch TV. Well, there was that guy who we reacted to ages ago when Shooter Get was announced as the Doctor, and he was that old guy, but he had like hundreds of thousands of subscribers on YouTube, and he was like, I was watching ITV, and I took a notepad when the adverts came on to count how many brown and black people there were in the adverts. Well, there was the Heritage England advert, and there was a black family, and of course black people don't have interest in like local history, so that was just forced. It was crazy, but so many people are just so soup-brained that they are unable to watch media, and if there's not white people in it, it just fundamentally snaps something in their brains, and they just can't focus on anything else. We saw this with the Church on Ruby Road, when there was the guy who was just livid at the idea of there being an all-black foster family, and by all-black, it means a black woman and her mother, and that was the all-black foster family. I think it was Reaper who said that. Yeah, it's unhinged shit. It's like, it's Bolstrek brain, where it's like, oh, these nasty white background actors, and it's like, what you just can't engage with media like outside of this identity politics framework.
A few minutes later,
it was him that started changing history to include more black people and stuff like that. There is, of course, a quote.
Of all of the things that you could bring up about the Stephen Moffat era supposedly being woke, you know, not the super feminist Clara at the center of the universe overtones, not the, you know, the clear 12 and Nardole shipping, not the gender change between, you know, the Master and Missy, and also what happened with the Corsair and the Doctor's wife. No, none of that stuff. Not, you know, River Song, Amy Pond, ardent feminist characters. No, not that. It's the inclusion of historically accurate black people. That's the line he draws. That's the first thing he brings up.
Changing history to include more black people and stuff like that. There is, of course, a quote that Moffat actually made quite a while ago now. It was on Doctor Who TV, which I'm trying to find now to bring up for you guys. And it says here, this is a quote again.
God damn it. I mentioned this earlier. This is why I don't like the interview. Because...
attributed to Stephen Moffat.
God's sake, Moffat, why did you say this? Unironically, I'm on the side of will of the fans here. Surely that somebody who's meant to be a wordsmith wouldn't say something so stupid.
And we've kind of got to tell a lie. We'll go back into history and there will be black people where historically there wouldn't have been, and we won't dwell on that. We'll say to hell with it, this is the imaginary better version of the world. By believing in it, we'll summon it forth. And outside of the fiction, it's about anyone feeling that they can be involved in this industry as an actor, a director and a writer. It's hugely important and it's not good. When we fail on that, we must do better.
Okay, now the second half of that I agree with, because so much of like popular culture and what are the like enduring franchises that are still going around in the 21st century, like your superhero stories and your James Bond and, you know, all of these franchises that were started in the mid 20th century were started during time, you know, when like Jim Crow laws were still in effect, when like segregation was still a thing. You know, Superman is like over 100, like how old is Superman? Action Comics came out in 1938, so it's nearly 90 years old, Superman. It's like black people couldn't even vote or sit in the places where they wanted to on the bus when Superman came around. When the Jim Crow laws were taken away and civil rights was enacted and such, obviously things didn't change overnight. It wasn't like a single flick of a switch and all of a sudden there was equality. There was all of these centuries of like systemic issues that had to be contended with, and a lot of that also includes proliferation in media. So that's why so much of like popular culture, and because we are like a slave to franchises and long-running series and stuff, why there is the push to gender swap or race swap and things like that now with reboots and revivals, and that's because the quote-unquote original versions, like, people of color weren't represented in that fiction, in that media originally, which is why there's a concerted effort to try and rectify that. Why you will get some plays which will race swap a character, like it's part of an, like, it's why you can sometimes like have some like stories, like for example, I was watching a clip the other day of Guys and Dolls. I can't remember why I was watching a Guys and Dolls clip. I was watching a Guys and Dolls clip the other day, and it was like a recent modern revival, and there was a lot of like black gangsters on the stage, as well as like white gangsters as well. But when the original film came out, the MGM film with Frank Sinatra and Marlon Brando, it was White City, you know, But now like it's more accurately represented in terms of the time period of New York and Guys and Dolls, but also it's just more like, it's just something that you didn't see before, but you see now because there's more parity in terms of representation. Like, we're now just sort of catching up to actual demographics in reality on screen. That's taken like a very, very long time to get there. And now that it's actually happening, people, like Will of the fans, are fucking livid about it. But when it comes to this quote, and we've got to tell a lie, we'll go back into history and there'll be black people where historically there wouldn't have been, and we won't dwell on that. He's responding specifically to Thin Ice, with a Series 10 story. And Thin Ice takes place in the London Frost Fairs. It's 1814 is the setting of the London Frost Fair. So if you just Google Black people London 1800s, in the 18th century England, there was a black population of around 15,000 people. They lived mostly in major port cities, London, Liverpool and Bristol, but also in market towns, villages and the country. So like they don't have to tell a lie for Thin Ice. They were there. Like, one reason why conservatives get so bloody angry like about the idea of like representation in media, black people specifically, is because, and follow me here, genuinely, they don't view black people as human. They don't view them as people who have existed on this planet at the same time as white people. They kind of view them as a demographic, as a fucking mutation that just popped up in, like, when Martin Luther King Jr. came around or whatever, or when the ships came in to, like, drop off slaves and stuff. That's when they were born. That's when they were introduced. Genuinely, they treat them like fucking X-Men, like some weird mutation that's just recently popped around, and now they're just now asking for rights or whatever. Obviously, it's ludicrous. It's lunacy. It's like an ahistorical reading, but that's why they view it like that. It's why when you get, like, Horrible Histories doing that rap for Black History Month about we've always been here, like, black people have always been in the UK, they've always been a part of the population. But for people like Will of the Fans and other reactionaries and conservatives, they're like, oh, well, you know, with 18th century London frost fairs, black people didn't come, like, they didn't exist then, they've just been planted there. Like, it's stupid, which is why this quote from Stephen Moffat annoys me so much. Like, we've got to tell a lie. It's not a lie. Like, fair enough if you want to tell an idealized version of history or whatever, but in Thin Ice specifically, which is what this story is about, it's not a lie. It's stupid. It's not a good quote. Like, ironically, Stephen Moffat does actually lie when he's talking about telling a lie here. I don't know, maybe Moffat's playing 5-dimensional chess here or whatever, but yeah. It's frustrating.
Okay, as woke as it gets there, really. Yes, basically just saying we're going to change history. We're going to put black people where there weren't black people, much like they recently did, or RTD recently did with Isaac Newton being an Indian-looking dude, changing gravity to mavity and all that rubbish that really has no business being in it. But this is supposed to be a pseudo-intellectual show, right? And thus we should be as factually accurate as we can be in order for the fiction to seem legitimate.
Firstly, that's stupid. Marco Polo did not travel with his caravan with the TARDIS and the First Doctor. William Shakespeare did not fight witches. Isaac Newton did not invent the theory of mavity. Agatha Christie did not fight a giant wasp. The Crimean War was not fought by fucking Sontarans, etc., etc. But once again, it's just the idea. And I'm very glad that Will of the Fans is just being pretty explicit with this. He absolutely hates the idea of an ahistorical Doctor Who story when it comes to race. You know, you can't have black people when it comes to, like, in settings and environments when they shouldn't exist. Okay? But then he also complains about characters like Bill. He also complains about the Ncuti Gatwa and Yasmin Finney. Like, so they just don't want black people on screen. It's so apparent. It's so obvious. They don't want them in historically inaccurate settings. They don't want them in historically accurate settings, and they don't want them as fictional characters in and of themselves. They just... this is it. It's so simple. They just hate black people.
This is one of the central conceits of wokeism in the first place. But there's a difference here between what Mr. Moffat says and what usually gets said. Because usually, if I call out the fact that a character has been race swapped, I'm going to get called a racist. Straight out of the gate, the producers of the show come out, they insult the fans. This
is obviously a lie, but obviously you can point out that, for example, Isaac Newton is meant to be a white... There's no harm in pointing it out, and nobody takes issue with you pointing it out and be like, oh, it's the actor from It's a Sin, oh, it's the Asian actor from It's a Sin. You're only racist if it becomes your defining personality trait to get angry about it online. Obviously, that's not the only barometer for racism, but it's what we're dealing with here. The idea that you're getting so bent out of shape over a jokey prequel where Isaac Newton discovers the theory of mavity, that's where the racism comes in. Pointing out that something is a race swap is not inherently racist. Pointing out that something is a gender swap is not inherently sexist, for example. You know, like, the observation in and of itself is fine. It's what you do with the observation. It's what you imply with the observation. That's where any potential bigotry and problematic elements can come in.
They defend it, or alternatively, they absolutely ignore it and act as if there's nothing strange whatsoever about the race swap, that there's nothing worth noticing, and that if you notice it, you're the racist, as opposed to the people who change someone's color because it matters, apparently, which I would argue is the real racism.
But who said that, though? You're on about the Isaac Newton example. I'm pretty sure that's pretty apparent. But who said this? You're just making shit up now. Once again, lying deliberately. You're making this shit up. No one has said this. Like, I genuinely don't think a single creative involved in Wild Blue Yonder has publicly commented on the race swap of Isaac Newton. Like, let me know in the comments or in the chat or whatever if I'm wrong, but genuinely, I don't think anybody officially involved in the production, from RTD to the actor himself who played Isaac Newton, Nathaniel Curtis, I don't think anyone has actually mentioned this or pointed it out. Like, or made a big comment about it. Right? But once again, you need to sort of like project an enemy here. You need to construct an enemy here to get angry at.
But Moffat here says something kind of different. He says, and we've got to tell a lie. The first thing he says there is not even a tacit, a total acknowledgement of the fact that going back in history and inserting black people where historically there wouldn't have been is telling a lie.
God, I hate this quote so much.
This is one of the many reasons why I've never really believed that Mr. Moffat actually does buy into all of this wokeness, especially because as it became more and more egregious, he and Capaldi left the show. This has always been something that has required clarification from Mr.
Holy shit, I mentioned this earlier. The idea that, like, apparently the idea here is that Stephen Moffat did not want to cast someone like Pearl Mackie and was maybe forced to by the BBC. Maybe he was, like, forced to include, like, black characters in Thin Ice or Empress of Mars and stuff. Like, but this is where the fucking conspiracy shit comes in. Where it's like unironically, this guy is like only a couple of steps removed from the Jewish question, like Dave Cullen. The idea that, it was actually some secret cabal of Jewish people who influenced Stephen Moffat from the BBC in order to include more woke elements. Unironically, that's like the genesis of this idea that, like, Dave Cullen landed on later on.
Moffat, and again, something he has not ever clarified for any of us. So then,
it's pretty depressing, like, this guy's thought process. The idea that Stephen Moffat was apparently only forced to write a character like Bill, bring in a terrific actor like Pearl Mackie, tell a pretty effective and powerful LGBTQ plus story about literal conversion therapy with the Cybermen, but apparently he didn't actually want to do it. Like, I've mentioned this before. It's the idea that when did I mention this? The idea of removing agency from the creatives involved. The idea that Stephen Moffat actually has no agency or has no creative input as a writer in order for this narrative to work. That Stephen Moffat was forced to write a Cyberman Bill conversion therapy story. That he was forced to put non-white actors in the story. That he was forced to maybe change the gender of the Master for Missy. That he was forced to make Clara or Amy in River Song super feminist or whatever. It just removes the idea that Stephen Moffat is a creative with his own agency, with his own ethos and his own thought processes. It sort of like belittles and diminishes Stephen Moffat's input as a writer, but he needs to do that in order for this narrative to stick. Like, he mentioned in the last video that he and his group of friends consider Stephen Moffat to be like a god when it comes to writing. I think that was the word he used. Like, it was like a god. But it seems to have, like, so little regard for Stephen Moffat as a creative in order for this narrative to stick, that he was forced to do this by the BBC, and that Stephen Moffat didn't have any pull or clout, even though he delivered, like, a massively successful run of Doctor Who and Sherlock at the same time as well. Like, surely the BBC would probably just leave him alone to do whatever he wanted.